All right, welcome to Craft Politics, everyone. I'm Joseph Lavoie.
I'm Andrew Percy.
And what are we drinking this week?
We're in London, so we're in the UK. So we're drinking a beer that's not from London, but this is actually from Cornwall in the southwest of England. I've never been to Cornwall, but it's beautiful. But this is by Verdant is the brewery. It's called Putty. They only brew Putty. Well, they release a new Putty every year, so this is Putty 2025. I had to check the can because I wasn't sure what year it is. So I think they update the brew, they change the recipe a bit. So this is Putty. It sells out really quickly. I've just looked online; it's all sold out. So my favourite brewery, probably from the UK, is Verdant. So it's quite hard to get into, but yeah, this is a very good brew. Say something about beer, Joseph.
I'm just distracted by the fact that you are incredibly backlit. So good thing we got the second camera angle going over there.
Because the sun shines on the righteous, right?
No, this beer it's.
You actually had one last night. So
I had one last night, but it is a treat every year to try and get your hands on this particular brew because every year, well, it sells out so quickly, but it's also incredibly delicious. And so this one's no different. We had a preview of it last night, but
keep both for myself.
Cheers. Okay, so we are in London. We're going to get to London stuff in just a second, but
to London stuff.
London, UK stuff.
English, British
UK
stuff,
politics. We are, but of course, I think we should just quickly touch on yesterday was the French debates for the Liberal leadership campaign. Lots of headlines coming out of it, primarily rightly or wrongly, reactions to the quality of Mark Carney's French, given he is the front runner, and given that to this point we've seen that he's performed well in Quebec-based polls. And so what's to come after his performance last night? I've watched snippets. I confess I did not watch the entire debate because I have better things to do with my life than spend 90 minutes watching that thing. However, I did watch bits and pieces of it, and his French is what you would typically expect from an Anglophone who is well briefed on the language, but doesn't sound natural. And he sounded very uncomfortable, very staccatic in how his French sounded. And it meant that at moments he didn't have the clarity a political communicator should have. So, of course, the big famous headline right now is that he had this gaffe where it sounded like he was endorsing Hamas. He actually wasn't, and I think in the moment it was clear that he wasn't.
That might work with some voters in Canada, I'm sorry to say. But
so my take is on this that everyone's gotten really excited about his performance in the polls and how the Liberal brand has had a bit of a bump as a result of him coming in the race, or alternately as a result of the Trump stuff. I was sharing this view with some of your mates last night that I still think he is an unproven campaigner. And it just takes a couple mishaps. It takes a couple days in a row where you're just not campaigning very well, and suddenly things start to turn.
And it might not be his French, right? It might actually be that he's not a great political communicator in English, that he'll have slips in English that somebody more seasoned might know not to make because he's never had to do campaigning, right? So we'll see. I mean, I'm just shocked to hear he's not perfect because some of the beatification of him in some of the media is just like ridiculous, right? I think personally, and the thing I find strange about it, and I would say we're both on the right, so you'd expect us to say this is like even if he becomes leader, all the things that have been wrong are still wrong. It's like, but it's obviously, you look at the polls, it's like, oh, well, that means everything's gone then. It's like, no, the housing issues are still the problem, the fact crime.
My takeaway on this is, for those paying attention to this, yesterday was a critical moment. If he continues to have moments where he's just not campaigning particularly well, this is where, hey, on the other side, someone who has been campaigning for the better part of the last 20 years of his career may outperform. But
we'll see. It's still, I mean, the polling is interesting, right? That it's still kind of, I mean, I think it was Eric Grenier who's giving, which is a really good podcast, The Numbers, this 75% chance of a Conservative victory. That you thought, it's 75%, but that's down quite a lot.
Yeah.
From it was basically a 96 or 98%. I think it was that. Anyway, so
as quickly as it's changed in the last 10 to 21 days, it can also
it can go, or it can continue to go. Well, it's still this is yet to be written.
Yet to be written.
Yet to be written. UK politics.
Yes, so I think it'd be good for our listeners to get a sense of, so we are in London, obviously recording this as we talked about, but we are here and we've got two really interesting interviews that we've teed up. One with Lord Wharton and one with Simon Hart. We'll get into those interviews shortly, but I think it'd be useful for you to talk about, give us a primer on what's happening right now in UK politics and why these two interviews were set up.
Let's do it the other way around. So the two individuals, Simon Hart came into Parliament the same year as me, 2010, left in 2024 in different circumstances. I chose to leave. But Simon was the chief whip under Rishi Sunak's government. So the chief whip obviously is in charge of party discipline, the whole managing the parliamentary party. Anyway, has released his diaries in a book called Ungovernable, which is the first chief whip to release their diaries because the General Convention is chief whips don't. So it's getting quite a lot of pickup because some of the extracts from his diary are a little bit salacious, shall we say? Spicy, shall we say, yes. Sensitive Canadian ears may struggle to understand this, right? So that's really, and he's a good mate as well, and so the book is launched this week, so we're going to the launch tomorrow night. So we've got him on, and then the other one is James Wharton, Lord Wharton now, Baron Wharton of Yarm, who was a Conservative MP between 2010 and 17, but importantly ran Boris's leadership campaign in the beginning phase with the parliamentary party after he'd departed the Commons, but. So he's given us a general talk through on British politics because, of course, UK politics has had this big change. This Labour government came in July of last year, massive majority in Parliament, despite only winning just over a third of the vote. And then on the right of politics, you've got this thing which will sound familiar, which is the Conservative Party was trashed in that election into one of its worst results, if not worst result ever, but certainly in modern times. Lost 200 MPs. Retained official opposition status, but the Reform Party, which is Nigel Farage, people may know him, he's the leader of, which came out of the Brexit party, and before that UKIP, the UK Independence Party, has been eating both the Conservative and Labour vote alive, eating it for lunch, and is now leading in quite a lot of the opinion polls. So you've got this division on the right, which sounds very familiar to in Canada, different in some ways, but familiar. And so UK. And
the other thing that's familiar to Canadians will be that, and Lord Wharton gets into this with us, is that if these numbers were to hold in an actual at the ballot box, you'd have really for the first time in the UK a three-party system.
Part of three-party, yeah, because depending on where this ends, the polling at the moment in many of these. Reform could be the biggest party, could be the second biggest party, there might be the third party, but with 100 plus MPs. So this is an existential threat probably to the Conservative Party, but interestingly to the Labour Party, because Labour have plummeted about 10% in the opinion polls since the election last year. So they've lost a third of their support already.
Which is insane, because they won in July, right? So it hasn't been that long.
No honeymoon. But it was a loveless landslide, right? People wanted rid of the Tories because we'd been in and we'd been fighting ourselves. It was a soap opera. And the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer's figures, net favourability are now worse than Rishi Sunak's when he got trashed at the election. But they're also taking a lot of vote from traditional Labour voters in Labour heartlands. So real state of flux in UK politics. But if we're going to talk about some of the issues at the moment, I think there's one we should pull out today because I think this links to Trump and to the US and everything else is happening, is the Labour government here has just reduced foreign aid spending, announced today it's reducing foreign aid spending to 0.3% of gross national product.
0.3%.
0.3. When David Cameron came in, the Conservatives, in 2010, we had a pledge and we increased it to a record percentage, which was 0.7% of GNP. So it was the highest aid budget ever. I got a lot of stick from a lot of Conservative voters for that. They didn't like it. A couple of years ago, I think it was under Boris, we reduced it temporarily to 0.5% of GNP. And Labour opposed that, and I remember them saying lots of terrible things about us for doing that. Well, today, they've just announced it's going down to 0.3%, and they're going to move that money into defence, into the defence budget, and increase defence spending to, I think, 2.5% of GDP. So the UK is one of the very few countries that hits the 2% threshold for NATO, about 2.2 or 3 at the moment, I think, and that's going up to 2.5. So the thing I find most interesting about this is, one, the rank hypocrisy of, and Labour's manifesto was to increase it to 0.7% again. So the rank hypocrisy, because I was actually always a defender of foreign aid spending, because I thought it was quite important for helping on a lot of the migration issues. And
I'm the same way. I actually think it's important for...
It was for our national security.
Yeah.
You know, the funding education was good for counter-extremism in some places. There's a lot of waste, and there's a whole industry around, like, aid, and you can see what some of these people are earning, and lots of it is certainly would go into that, what many people consider too woke. So there was, leaving all that aside, the fact still remains that I always thought it was quite a selfish spend, foreign aid, because it sounds very selfish, but actually no, what we were doing is reducing the push factors on migration, which is a selfish thing to try and limit the number of people who would try to come here illegally, and also trying to protect some of our national security interests, and also benefit some of our economic interests by growing economy in other developing countries, which we then would benefit from. However, leaving all that argument aside on it, right? And a lot of people just think it's a waste of money, and why are we paying? Charity begins at home, I used to hear a lot.
Yep.
However, it's this, when we reduced it to 0.5%, I remember the noise and screeching from the Labour benches, which apparently now is muted, and they're down to 0.3%. But this is the Trump effect again.
Yeah.
So US aid has been cut. So there's that element of it. Like, ordinarily, all these people who are on the left of politics here would be appalled at US aid going. We're now cutting it. But why? It's because of this requirement for Europe to step up and take on much more of a burden when it comes to our own defence of this continent. So it's the Trump effect. So Trump's ability to change policy, which we've talked a lot about, his ability to change policy in Canada, the fentanyl stuff, the border stuff, extends much beyond North America. So we've now got in the UK a new Labour government with this great pledge on 0.7%, is not only breaking that quite impressively, but actually breaking it in a really quite severe way to respond to Donald Trump's.
Well, and I suspect this is the first. It's the domino. There's going to be a domino effect, and we've already heard Pierre Poilievre come out on this when he did his Arctic announcement a couple of weeks ago. There is going to be a change in how Canada and what the amount that Canada spends on international development, foreign aid, and it wouldn't shock me to see a version of this once we have a new prime minister, an elected prime minister, elected by the people of Canada. Once we have that prime minister in place, I could see that being just such a quote unquote easy way to shift resources over to national defence spending.
And the strange thing here of a Labour government doing it, so a government on the centre left doing it, is they can actually do it knowing that they've got the cover of, currently in the polls between the Reform and Conservative Party, they're pushing 45-50%. So nobody on the right is going to seriously oppose this, knowing it's probably actually quite popular with the public generally.
Yeah.
And it's going into the military, and that's sort of people on the right, like, yes, we must spend more on our military. We're often not as good as our rhetoric on that, I have to say, and the Harper government was an example of that.
True.
My own government was, in some respects, we were okay but not great. So they know they can do this, and they're not going to take heat from the main opposition, or the public probably.
Right.
So it's for Labour, it's actually, for them, it'll be painful on the left
with their own base of supporters.
They haven't really got anywhere else to go at the moment.
Right.
And even a lot of their own supporters will be supportive of it, I would think, because a lot of their bases, working class communities in the north of England, who will be much less plugged into the international aid arguments than their middle class base in London and major metropolitan settlements. So I just think it's this, and I find myself in a strange position on it as well, because I'm like, of course I want to spend more money on the military. We've got to spend more money, and there's going to be £13 billion a year extra this will unleash for. Sorry, was I boring you? Is that like? Sorry, was that? Oh,
No, I just got some messages. Tell Andrew to stop rambling on.
Is it the people from the pub the other night saying, stop texting us, we're not your friends? How did you get my number? Like, you know, we've moved to Winnipeg. It's like any excuse. But anyway, I just thought that today has just come out, and I thought this is, you know, it's politics makes hypocrites of a lot of people, because this is where I think all the public kind of look at this and think, oh, politicians, you say one thing, do the other. This is one of those things of, you know, they have this pledge, and yes, they want to do that, but actually now, given that there seems to be a bit of an abandonment, the most important thing for this country and for this continent more broadly is the defence of Europe, because there is a real threat to this now, and so this money has to go there. And this is one of those things where politicians end up sometimes doing things that they don't intend to do or that they would prefer not to, and people think, oh, that's just typical. It's actually, no, it's just the reality of the situation, right? Circumstances change, and you end up having to do things because the priorities have changed that may not be in line with what you said you would do, and that's like in every walk of life, right?
And I sometimes try and, when we like to talk politics, but I like to bring it back to like what it means for business, right? Or in this case, what it means for not-for-profits and charities. And that is that like nothing's banked, nothing's guaranteed, and we now live in political times that change. It feels like by the minute, or certainly by the day. And what was conventional for so long is like nothing is holy anymore, right? And so you have to invest some time, I think, in risk scenario planning, identify the potential risks, and I think this is going to force a lot of organizations in the international development space to look at ways of generating new revenue flows and redesigning their businesses. Is that frustrating? Yes, but unfortunately, that's the only option.
So this is just, you know, but this goes to the point of, you know, whether you're in business, whether you're not, whatever, you have to proper, as you say, scenario plan and have your relationships and your ducks in a line for when this kind of stuff happens.
Yeah. So if you are a charitable organization, a not-for-profit right now in the international development space, you got to start planning for the assumption that this is going to happen everywhere else. So Canada's going to do the same. This is coming. It's coming Canada's way. And I think it could come even if it is a Liberal government in that crazy scenario, because they're going to have to find cost savings somewhere. And they're going to have to demonstrate to Trump that we are matching on other things.
Yeah, and Canada has so far to go on defence, right?
Yeah.
So where's it going to take it from? Is it going to cut it from, you know, social programs? Probably not. I mean, there'll be some at the edges. Is it going to cut it from, you know, spend that Canadians every day see and feel? No, you're going to go for the bit that is much less. I know, sorry, I drank more of it, so there's some left. You can have it.
I'll have the
you know, an international aid in that respect is an easier fit, because your day-to-day citizens don't feel it, right?
Yeah.
I still think the effects can be quite bad can be more costly because of those things we talked about at the beginning. However, you want to go for something that's politically popular. It's kind of like, okay, you know, we're going to invest in our brave men and women in the military, and we're going to do that because we're going to have to cut the, you know, sad as the way are to do it, we have to, you know, take from here to invest in our brave girls and boys in uniform.
So it's interesting to keep an eye on, because the diplomacy approach that we're seeing from Keir Starmer, I think, is a bit different than what we've seen from other leaders around the world to how they're handling Trump. And so I'm curious to see if, you know, Starmer seems to be much more which is odd because he's of a different political stripe, but Starmer's approach seems to be much more, I'm going to try and woo Trump and meet him where I can and not pick fights. So I'm going to be very interested to see how that plays out for the relationship between these two countries.
Totally. And you saw the UK not retaliating on steel tariffs. So, you know, made the decision that, you know, because there is that thing of, I suppose there's, and it's weird because if this had been a Conservative government and we'd been in opposition, I know exactly what Keir Starmer would be saying about Donald Trump right now. You know, there would be faux outrage, it would be appalling, how dare. You know, I remember when Theresa May went off as the first foreign leader from Europe or anywhere maybe to see Donald Trump after he'd won. The Labour Party were outraged by this. Now he can't get on a plane quick enough to go and see Donald Trump. And, you know, I suppose you know, we talk about that special relationship between the UK and the US because we are so integrated militarily and so integrated intelligence-wise but also economically, they're the UK's biggest single trading partner. But also, the US actually has a trade surplus with the UK, as we've talked about before. So for Starmer, it's just a different game compared to others. And the Europeans have always looked at the Brits as that halfway house between. So it's interesting that he's going to Washington as an emissary of the European Union as well. But again, you had the example of Blair and Bush, who were technically from different sides.
Yeah, you're right.
So
There's precedence for this.
This has happened throughout history, where prime ministers and presidents of different parties have actually ended up very tight relationships. So I don't know. It's one to watch.
It's interesting. So we're going to cut to, in this first episode, in this double episode in this week. This first episode, we're going to cut to Lord Wharton. He's going to give us sort of an even more in-depth view of where things stand with the Conservative Party. He's got his own perspectives on how Labour's handling this, and we'll even get into Trump and Ukraine. So it's a very interesting conversation.
I will say issues. I'll do this bit because
fuck off.
Because otherwise,
I was going to do it. I was going to own the story.
No, you weren't going to own it because you could have said, "Oh, there was a technical issue." So Mr. Perfect here, he was like, has now bought me this new microphone, by the way, which is very nice of him because mine was crap. Messed up the technology and didn't actually have Lord Wharton's microphone on. So he might sound a bit distant.
So yeah, unfortunately...
he is emotionally distant anyways, Jay. He's a dear friend, but, completely dead inside, right? It's what we used to joke about. But yeah, because you messed up.
So yeah, the tech did not work the way we wanted it. So we've done our best to improve the audio, but fair warning, it's not the best audio you'll hear. So we'll try and put some subtitles on it. The audio is better for the interview that we'll have that'll come out tomorrow. And that's the interview that we have with Simon Hart. So we're timing the release of that episode with the release of his book. And so, yeah, next up we got Lord Wharton. Deep dive on a bunch of issues, and we hope you enjoy it.
Really happy today. We got my good mate, Lord Wharton, Baron Wharton of Yarm, used his full title. But James was a member of the House of Commons. We came together in 2010 in the David Cameron wave. James... what do you say? You retired from politics in 2017?
The electorate retired.
Yeah, the electorate retired you. You might not know this, Joseph, but in that election, lots of Tory MPs' majorities went down. Mine actually went up, and some of them lost. But it worked out all right for...
I'm one of those lucky few who exited at the right moment.
But it worked out all right for James, because, as you can tell, he's now Lord Wharton of Yarm, so he's now a member of the House of Lords. Previously chaired the higher education regulator. I was a minister in the Theresa May and David Cameron government. I actually took over from you as Minister for the Northern Powerhouse, another job you were happy to pass on to somebody else, right?
I'm always pleased to see a job well done by a worthy successor.
But it's also very dry. More importantly, though, for the purposes of today, well, actually not more important for the purposes of today, but you also chaired Boris's leadership campaign, of which I'm still waiting for the book to come out. But anyway, we've got James on today because we're going to just have a quick look through and talk through kind of British politics. Some of our listeners in Canada might not be able to relate to this, but where the Conservatives don't really know James, but in Canada have been like 20 points ahead, although the polls are a bit mixed at the moment, for a very long time. Obviously, that's not what the British Conservatives can claim. So, quick overview where we are in British politics. Tories got a massive shellacking in July in the general election. Down to 121 seats, almost record low, I believe. Now currently languishing at third in the polls. The resurgent. So this might sound familiar to Canadians actually. A Reform Party is eating the Conservative vote alive. A Reform Party led by Nigel Farage. So how dangerous is this for the Conservatives? What's your view on where things are at the moment?
I think it is. I mean, it's a period of real uncertainty in terms of the political dynamic. So, as you sort of point out in your introduction, we have an unpopular Labour government, we have an unpopular Conservative Party, and we have a seemingly relatively popular insurgent Reform Party. And at the last election, the Conservatives did incredibly badly, but actually Labour didn't do that well. It did very well in terms of seats, but its vote share wasn't particularly high. It wasn't what you consider normally a vote-winning share of the vote.
It was like 34%.
Yeah, and normally you lose on that.
Yeah.
So what's quite interesting, I think Reform's up to now to 27, 28. That's not, or would normally not be, a vote share that would win you an election either. And I don't think realistically it's still very likely Reform would win a general election. The question is what impact they would have, and that's in two ways. How many MPs would they get? So they've got 5 at the moment. They could increase that if things continue on the current path. But also, what impact they'll have in who are they taking votes from and where. And at the last election, it was pretty clear that it reformed a lot of damage to the Conservatives. It contributed to the collapse of the Conservative vote in a lot of constituencies. I think the additional votes reforms picked up, though, there's some evidence they're now coming from Labour. And Reform are effectively appealing to the traditional left-leaning Labour voting, white working class, often northern, in an English context at least, voter. Boris Johnson appealed to them in a way that Conservatives haven't for a very long time when he won a big majority in 2019. They seem to have more or less left the Conservative Party. The red wall, as they call it, has crumbled. And that's ripe territory for reform. But what I think is additionally interesting about that is that's happening everywhere. We saw it with the AfD in Germany now, the recent elections there. I think we've seen it in some of the rise of Trump, and some of Trump's base being from a non-typical Republican base. So there's something bigger going on in Western politics.
And arguably too in Canada. That, you know, a lot of the Conservative rise in Canada is from people who were union, blue collar, you know, working class. So it's exactly the same kind of voter coalition being put together there.
Yeah, I think the challenge of that is, so if the Conservatives want to do that, you kind of need to find a way to be the reassuring insurgent, which is not easy to do. And given how strong Reform is in its narrative, I think the Conservatives here are going to struggle to claim that ground. Best chance they've got, realistically, is probably to maintain narratives that's worked in many elections in this country for many years, which is you're either going to get a Conservative government or a Labour one, and force the choice. I think to get people to be enthusiastic in large numbers to vote Conservative will be difficult. And that itself is quite a damning statement. That's not a great place to be.
Yeah, I mean, and that's always worked for us. I remember the 2015 election? We all thought, James and I both had seats. We'd won off Labour in 2010. We thought the polls were quite close in 2015. We thought we were at risk of losing our seats. And we had this big, you know, all our campaign was, if you don't vote Tory, you're going to get a coalition of chaos, right? And we kept people our way. I tried that this election in the 2 ridings, constituencies next to me, which we won in 2019. We lost by 3,000 votes. In one of them we came third. Reform took like 9,000 to 10,000 votes in each of those seats. When I tried that on the doorstep in 2019, and this is perhaps to your point about what's happening in Western democracy, when I said, well, you're going to get a Labour government, so many of the people who previously voted Conservative in 2019 just said to me, doesn't matter, you're all the same. And that's what's behind a lot of this, right, is that you're all the same. Something the Canadian Conservatives don't have because they've been out of power for a decade. But, you know, for the Conservative Party, here, the British Conservative Party, it has a record of 14 years in power. Not all of that, this might shock you, Joseph, not all of that 14 years was entirely positive.
Right. Or Conservative.
Or Conservative. Yes.
But the other interesting angle that we have in Canada is Pierre Poilievre is definitely positioned himself as the populist option. The really small populist party in Canada has effectively become non-existent as a result of how he's been able to appropriate that side of the spectrum. I wonder, like, to me here, it seems like Reform is much stronger in shape, and I wonder if it's realistic or reasonable for the Conservative Party to scoop in those votes that have been going to Farage. What are the dynamics here?
I think they're going to have to be clever about it, and cleverer than they're demonstrating at the moment that they have the capacity to be. And let's be clear, it's very early days. Kemi Badenoch has been leader for about 6 months, so let's see where this goes. But the early signs are not, they don't make me enthusiastic about the trajectory that we're on. The challenge, I think, in British politics is you want to capture some of that. You want to find the salient issues that are causing people to change their vote, and to find a position on them that is both the right thing to do, but also attractive, that you can sell it. But if you go too populist, if you sound over the top in jumping on every passing bandwagon, firstly, people don't trust you, and secondly, you put off the middle of the ground voters that you need to win as well to build that broad coalition to actually form a government. We saw that in the Conservative leadership election with 2 finalists, Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick. And Kemi won by effectively saying almost nothing. She kept her head down, kept out of the way. Robert Jenrick ran a very populist, reform-light kind of campaign.
He was copying Pierre Poilievre in their videos. He was doing very similar videos to Pierre Poilievre, and still is.
But it didn't work here. And whether that's, I'm not saying those videos don't work here. The package as a whole didn't work.
With the membership, which is more...
With the membership. I'm not sure it worked with the country either, to be honest. And I think part of that was lack of credibility. It would just come out of being a very centrist government to suddenly claim that you're now very populist on all these issues that, to talk to the average voter, I suspect they would say you did nothing about whilst you're in power for 14 years. It's too big a leap. So the challenge is going to be finding something that allows you to stay in the middle ground whilst hitting those key pressure points that are going to appeal to and answer the challenging questions on the issues that voters really care about, some sections of the voting public really care about.
Not responding to this kind of rise of populism potentially condemns the Conservatives to what they are at the moment, which is 21%. So what is the right route?
It's a good question. And firstly, I think take us back to Boris as a good example of this. Traditional, centrist, middle-class, educated, conservative voters didn't really like Boris in large numbers. Interestingly, that included most of the Conservative MPs who only allowed Boris to be leader of the party, really, when we were in serious trouble. There were people holding their nose to do it. And I remember a former colleague of ours who said to me that when you've tried everything on the table and there's nothing left, sometimes all you can do is turn the table upside down and see what happens. And that's why I'm voting for Boris, right? And that, it was kind of that, like, we're trying to name that person. What do we do? You might name that person, you might even interview them. So there's a big group of the sort of dinner party attendees who like to not like Boris. Yeah. But they didn't have anywhere to go in 2019, really. The Liberal Democrats were still very much down. Labour was very left-wing at that point, with Jeremy Corbyn as their leader. Reform actually did sign a deal with Boris, but Reform wouldn't appeal to them anyway. And so Boris was able to reach into the sort of disenchanted, previously Labour voting, white working-class voters, and actually infuse them to some degree, without losing that middle-class base, not because it liked him, which it didn't really have anywhere to go when they were worried about the country with all the other things that were going on. How to rebuild a coalition like that? Because, of course, you've had both sides now, in part, wander off into other places in frustration of not getting what they thought they were going to get from a Conservative government. It's going to be difficult. I guess one of the things that I would say is that if I was advising Kemi's team, it would be to be more active in opposing. So we have an opposition now which, if you watch the news, you would think that Reform is opposition. They grab the headlines. That's partly because they will say things that, because they're not so much trying to get those middle-of-the-road voters that have gone down, they can be more headline-grabbing. They can present things more as black and white. So that the Reform position, I think, is likely to feel clearer than the Conservative position. But that isn't really an excuse for the complete lack of policy routing. And I think what Kemi's team is do is pick some issues and go out there and have punchy policies that will upset some groups of voters, but will start to get media attention, get headlines. I think we've had one policy announcement, and it was something technical or innovation, I can barely remember. These are big issues, and we need big, strong policy positions on them. And I think if they do that without overdoing it, and start to actually do the job of being opposition, that would be a good start. At the moment, voters see Reform doing most of the opposing.
Yeah, so what Kemi Bain, not the Conservative leader, actually said here was she likened it to like a restaurant menu and said you don't make your menu choices 4 years before the visit to a restaurant. And this is her argument for not coming out with big, bold policies at this stage, which, and to some extent, you can see the rationale for that in the sense that ordinarily, when a party loses government, you know that it's the opposition party that is going to, at some point, rebuild and be the natural choice, because there isn't really a strong third party, because every other time, whichever governing party's lost, they've always placed second in the polls and been around 30%, right? But we're in a different position to that now. So waiting, it does feel like the Conservatives aren't on the pitch a lot of the time here.
I think they need to understand that they're in a fight to retain the sort of crown of being the opposition. Because in terms of media coverage, I don't think they're getting it. And they can't just assume they will be the number two party, never mind assume that they'll be the next party to form a government after Labour. And I don't think they recognise that. I think they're still fighting to be the next government, which is important, but they're neglecting to fight to continue to be the opposition, and Reform is going to eat their breakfast, as it were. And I kind of get what Kemi says on policies. You don't, this far out from an election, 4 years to go, everything can change. Why would you tie yourself down to a big raft of policies? But you're going to set out what you believe in and direction of travel and say what you want to achieve. And that doesn't have to have full policy detail. You've got to give people something to get hold of so they think they understand whose side you're on.
Yeah, I mean, if you linking it back to Canada, of course, everybody knows where the Conservatives are. It's axe the tax, stop the crime, build the homes. It's like this, you know what you're getting, right? But with the British Conservatives, you kind of, at the moment, it's not clear. And this fight of survival, which is what it is, right? And also with a parliamentary party which is decimated to 121, some of them have been there for decades.
But what I think they're doing, and Boris did this in a different way when he won the Red Wall and won seats, the Conservatives have never won in entire history of those constituencies and traditional Labour areas. And Reform is finding a way to do it now. There are a big group of people out there, not just in the UK actually, but across the Western democracies, who feel that no one is on their side, that no one cares about them, that, well, why should I vote the way that you tell me is sensible, because I've been doing it for years and I'm getting nothing for it.
Yeah, my community looks worse than it's ever looked. Exactly. High Street looks horrible.
And Reform, some of those people feel at least that Reform is trying to talk to them. It doesn't mean they agree with everything they say, but they just feel that, probably because they're against the right people as much as anything is being for the right thing, is that they're kind of on their side. I think Trump's a bit like that. I think a lot of people voted for Trump because they didn't like the system and the arrogance that you sometimes see that it feeds through the system. We saw it here with Brexit, when people who were against Brexit, we had the biggest popular vote we've ever had. People voted to leave, whether you think that's a good idea or a bad idea. And the games that were played in Parliament and the conventions and the rules that were bent and broken, and even the courts made findings that I think are questionable, not just in hindsight, but were at the time. And the public just got fed up and thought, who do you think you are? We've had a vote. Well, actually, whichever side of it they're on, they wanted to be dealing with. And similarly, I think the Democrats made a mistake in the US in the way that they tried to use the legal system to go after Trump. It may well be he's done things that are wrong, but it was pretty clear, or felt certainly clear as an outside observer, that the tools of the state were being used in a way they shouldn't be to persecute one of their opponents. And I think people don't like that. I think actually the greatest risk in British politics from Reform is to the two-party first-past-the-post electoral system. Because I'm a big fan of first-past-the-post for all sorts of reasons we'll bore your listeners with today. But it only really works with a two or at most 2.5 party system, which you kind of had with the Lib Dems. You start to move into a 4 or a 3.5 party system, however you might want to describe it, you really do start to see the system break down. It becomes very hard to justify such big majorities and small vote shares.
Well, and what we see in Canada is there's usually a ceiling for Conservatives, because at least the way politics shapes up in Canada, because three-party system, well, more than three, but there's really 3 national parties, and there's only so far that Conservatives can ever get in terms of total vote share. And that'd be my concern here in the UK, at least for the Tories, would be three-party system is going to, particularly if you're fragmenting the right. We had the right was broken up in Canada for the better part of a decade. That meant we were just guaranteed to never win, even when we had like decent support. It's just it never worked out well the way the vote splits and first past the post system carried across.
And when the Tories did win, it was sometimes with only like 30-somethings%, right? I mean, the Liberals are in power now with 30-something%. And that's until this election, that's unusual in the UK. I don't know if this was the first election, sub 40, but a winning party, because it's the two-party system, as you say, is broadly well. We've always won on around 40.
Yeah, I think Blair was 40 in 2005.
Blair was 40.
2005.
Yeah.
Because of Iraq.
It might have been a little bit lower because of Iraq, yeah. But, yeah, to your point there, the first past the post kind of relies on those two big parties. You could arguably it's already stopped working in Scotland. It's already stopped working in Wales because of the multi-party system. So that's why the SNP could win, 50-odd seats with only 35-40% of the vote. But anyway, to this, so.
But I just found that, that's quite a scary thing. Whatever people's views are on voting systems, it would unleash changes that you cannot predict. So there's a tendency in politics to really oversimplify how we understand the electorate. So, for example, one thing some people say here, some MPs or ex-Conservative MPs say, I lost by 5,000, Reform got 7,000 in my constituency, so if Reform hadn't stood, I'd have won. So, no, those 7,000 people did not want you. Some of them might still vote you, but a lot of them wouldn't. And there'll be a lot of churn underneath that, people going in all sorts of directions as people want to do. So to say, or taking our polling today, if we had a different electoral system and we applied these numbers, this is what would happen, that is almost certainly not what would happen. So really strange things would happen. And actually, ironically, it's been the centre-left and the Liberal Democrats in the UK that have most pushed for voting reform, because they would believe there's a progressive majority that gets cheated by the first-past-the-post system.
Can we, since we're here this week, there's just so much activity happening around Ukraine and Trump, and obviously the Trump factor is a big one for Canadians, obviously with the tariff issues, tariff threats. How is Trump being felt here? How influential is his approach to diplomacy, bilateral relations, or, even that's maybe a stretch to call it bilateral relations, but how much of an impact is he having in his first 100 days here?
So that's I less than in Canada. He hasn't targeted us particularly. He does seem to have a soft spot for the UK. Even when he's talking about problems with the EU and how dreadful the EU is, he said, the problems with the UK, but we can solve those, or whatever it is he said. He's kind of got a softer spot for the UK.
Well, his mum's from the UK, right? And he's always been a massive Anglophile.
And he loved the state visit.
Yeah, he loved it, yeah.
And
Loves the Royals.
Starmer's about to offer him another one, and apparently Starmer's going to get him invited to stay at Balmoral with King Charles. So they're rolling out the red carpet again to try to sort of play his ego as best they can. It doesn't mean there aren't big issues. You could struggle to imagine two politicians actually further apart than Sir Keir Starmer and Donald Trump. The most impactful thing he's doing, I think, in terms of British politics is on Ukraine at the moment. And that is quite concerning because, if nothing else, it's destabilising in terms of there's been a direction of travel, whether it was successful or not, whether you agree with it or not, where the West has been pulling together to some degree to support Ukraine. That appears to be at risk. And he appears to be putting a lot of pressure now on President Zelensky to hold, I think his plan is to go to hold an election. I'd be interested whether he'd win that. I mean, quite possibly not. I don't know the real views of the people of Ukraine, but I can't imagine Zelensky is hugely confident when, otherwise he wouldn't be avoiding it quite as aggressively as he is. And what then follows. And then there's this really interesting thing of he wants $500 billion worth of mineral rights, which I think is slightly overblown. And I've got a theory on this, but maybe I'm talking nonsense. It might actually be, were they to give it to Trump, were they to agree to give him this huge sort of slice of the pie, as it were, of Ukraine, it's the one thing that Putin might understand. So Putin, I think, looking at Trump, will say he doesn't care about Ukraine. He is not going to take the risk. I think Putin, looking at Trump, he cares about money and power and resources in the same way that Putin does. And if suddenly the US had a big stake in Ukraine, I think that would strengthen the view that the US would fight for Ukraine, or maybe not literally, but would be willing to make strenuous efforts to protect its newfound significant economic interests. So it may be that Trump is just being a greedy New York gangster and trying to squeeze as much as he can out of Ukraine because that's how he does business.
Right.
It might be that behind that, or as a side benefit to that, something along those lines, if it does happen, could actually what forces Putin eventually to find a peace that is acceptable, whatever that looks like.
This is the thing we've discussed before about Trump, which is so absolutely infuriating. Like on the Canada tariff stuff and the whole like Governor Trudeau and the 51st state and we're going to make it the 51st state. I mean, this is just, it's nuts. But yet behind all of the nuttiness, all of a sudden Canada is addressing the fentanyl issue, which is an absolute outrage, newcomer to see it there. You've been here in London, we just don't see it here, right? He's forced us to address the border issue in Canada. So every time he does these kind of utterly crazy things, there is always kind of there's something behind it. A bit with, in the Middle East at the moment, the craziness about the Riviera, the Gaza Riviera and all the rest of it. All of a sudden now, we're seeing Hamas being much more compliant, more hostages being released than for a very long period. So it's this whole, all of this, the unpredictability of him, which is the essence of Trumpism, right? Of just you don't know where it's going to go. Actually, can potentially be brilliant in the sense of, I don't mean Trump is brilliant because he absolutely isn't, but there is, what's that thing about a stopped clock is right twice a day, right? Yeah. It's a bit like that. Because it's so up in the end, you don't know where it's going to land, you can actually end up with an outcome which you're like, oh, actually, wow, that's...
Well, you're seeing it on now commitments about increasing share of GDP spending on defense. I think too much of the Western world has just banked on a free ride for so long, and
for 17
it's taken a bit of a lunatic to come out and reset the order on this. But
I mean, it is just, I don't know enough about Donald Trump's business history. My perception is this is what he's done his entire life. He makes it so unpleasant to not give him what he wants that people just find a way to mitigate it and make it go away. And he's had mixed success in business, but he's obviously been much more successful than I have. And credit to him for that. But I suspect this is how he does it. This has been the way he's lived his whole life. It's a kind of aggressive, slightly over the top deal-making style. And the problem with it in the context of being the president and effectively leader of the free world is that it works until it doesn't. And what do you do when it doesn't? Yeah. So maybe we'll never find out. Maybe nothing too serious will go wrong and he'll get his way on lots of things and it'll pass. It could get really badly wrong though, wouldn't it? Very quickly.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be interesting to see how the differences play out. So the Canadian approach has been, dollar for dollar responses on tariffs, right? You hit us hard, we'll hit you just as hard back, and we'll equalize. It seems like Starmer's taking much more of the let's see if I can woo him, keep him happy, let's just not take him on head on, and it'll be interesting to see how the different approaches play out in the next 6
Which I find fascinating. So Starmer could not be more the polar opposite. Starmer wants to be close to the European Union, not the US. Starmer is a managerial, civil servant type politician, very opposite to Trump. But we'll see if he does it. I mean, fair play to it. It's probably the right tactic from a UK point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's the wrong tactic. I just, it's the amusement of, had we been in government doing this, how the Labour opposition would have been about Trump, as they were when Trump was in power last time. You know, they were, I mean, Mandelson was, you know, so rude, our foreign secretary, so, and they're all now backtracking differences. Although, actually, there is a cautionary element here, though, for reform, of course, because if you look at the polling, it's only, I think, just half, or maybe just under, it's around 50% of their voters have a positive view. It's only about half have a positive view of Trump, which is, and you've seen Nigel Farage, who's a leader of reform, distance himself from Elon Musk on some of the Tommy Robinson. Tommy Robinson is a far-right activist in the UK, who I think reform sensibly should have nothing to do with. He's distanced himself from Trump on the Ukraine stuff. So it is actually potentially one of the threats to Farage and to the rise of reform is how the Trump stuff plays out.
It is. I think it could cut both ways. It also becomes a bit of it could become a kind of coming of age thing for reform, that they're growing up into a sensible party and able to do things like say, no, we don't agree with that, not just follow what Trump's been saying. And actually, sometimes leaders, to demonstrate they are the leader, want to take positions that you don't expect them to. So I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but I think it can work to Farage's benefit if he plays it right. And the Tommy Robinson thing, I think, plays well to Farage. Farage will actually, whenever he's asked about Tommy Robinson being in what was UK or what's reform, he is absolutely, I've never wanted in this party, I would never allowed it to happen. It's quite helpful to him, because some people like to accuse him of being far right.
Yeah.
And so actually having someone on the far right that he can slap about publicly and say, look, I didn't want him, did I, does him a favour.
Yeah, I mean, they're not far right, are they? They're traditional, I don't know what you call them, they're populist, but I wouldn't put them in the same mould as the AFD in Germany.
No. But then, I mean, these terms get thrown around. I think they're not. I'm sure some of their members are. Yeah. But because all parties have got some members with some slightly unusual views.
Most of them are our association executives. So my final question is from me. I don't know if Joseph has any more, but mine is Conservative Party 21%. Looks like it's pretty bad. To use your analogy of a former colleague, is it time to turn the tables? Throw everything up in the air again? Would Boris be able to abate this?
I don't see a route back. Well, not a clean route back for Boris, so I think it's going to happen. I think Boris is still popular. I don't think Boris is popular we're talking about this kind of like middle-class dinner party attenders, but then I don't think he ever has been. But he has an ability to get airtime and cut through that others do not. When a politician comes on the TV, most people reach for the remote to change the channel. Yeah. Boris gets an extra 15 seconds,
yes,
and he delivers a message on that. And that's all you need a lot of the time if you've got a good message. So there would be a route by which he could win. I'm not saying he's not damaged by his time in government. However, even the route for him to come back is quite hard, not least because if I was leader of the Conservative Party, the one thing I wouldn't want would be Boris coming back into the parliamentary Conservative Party, except no who's dropped it after.
It's funny with Boris because that when I went to see him, you got me the meeting if you remember when you were running his campaign. You said we all had to come in one by one. So I went to see Boris, and I did say to him, I once said on national TV I wouldn't put Boris Johnson in charge of a duster, let alone the country.
You've always been too honest for your own good.
Yeah, that was James's advice to me. Was stop telling people what you think. You do so much better. You progress so much more. If you could just keep telling people what you think.
You think such unpleasant things.
Yeah. I think good things for the people I used to represent. But anyway, I went into that meeting, of course, and then came out and voted for Boris in the leadership campaign because of just that. His ability, which is so strange considering he speaks Latin, he speaks Greek, ancient Greek, he's, Eton educated, everything that a, factory worker or a power station worker in Gould you would think would be against. In the same way they used to not be all that convinced on David Cameron, but for some reason Boris's ability just to understand what drives those people. I mean, I had a lot of steel workers in my patch. Boris just got steel, that we had to make steel, and spent a lot of money saving the steel industry in my patch. And it's strange for somebody with that background to just be able to connect, and just the way he can do it as well, which is why
this middle class dinner party, Andrew coming out.
It is,
I want to say it.
Yeah, I don't want to say it, but I can see how Boris's return would be a net positive for the Conservative Party. Whether it would be in the long term, I don't know, but certainly on some of that reform stuff, you could definitely see him abating some of that, just because inexplicably in many ways, considering there's so much that's just not good about how Boris does business. He can just connect. I mean, I saw when he came to visit my constituents, just his ability to just interact with people who even before said, I'm not a big fan of his. And then once he's done his interaction with them, there's very few politicians, very few who can do that. I mean, Starmer isn't in that category. Whether Kemi is, time will tell. But Farage a little bit, but nothing quite on that scale of Boris. Totally agree. It's bizarre.
I have one final question. It's totally off topic. I have a hard. Our audience sometimes writes us with notes to say we didn't understand what Percy told us because he'll use some random expression we've never heard of. So for our audience that is learning about the different accents that are here on the Great British Isles, how does your accent differentiate from Percy's?
I'm posher northern person.
He is posher northern, but he's a Teessider.
Yeah. So I'm a bit further up the coast.
Oh, okay.
But I don't have a thick Teesside accent.
No, you don't. But you have a lilt. You have a Teesside lilt.
Absolutely.
But you don't have the n and the of my flat vowels down in Hull.
No, my parents wouldn't let me do that.
Although Teesside and Humberside, so Humberside, which is East Yorkshire, North Lincolnshire, where I'm from, they're very similar communities. So we have very similar kind of areas we represented. So our people kind of same profile. People in our area think very similarly.
Same political trends.
Same political trends. Yeah, weirdly, both Humberside and Teesside were places that just trended strongly to the Conservatives under Boris, very pro-Brexit, former, and still industrial. But my accent is better.
We kind of just discovered this as new MPs when we were elected, talking about issues and how our areas we thought felt like, and we realised that the people we represented kind of felt the same about a lot of things. And I guess that's one of the reasons we became friends, because it wasn't his personality.
I was just drawn to James's money. That's it, right? He's got to have money, right, with that accent. He is posh northern, but still northern, of course, which is, it's actually fascinating explaining to people in Canada how just having a northern accent says so much about you, right? And people just, you'd often get a certain type of person in this country who's just, when they realise you say something insightful and intelligent, which I do quite regularly.
It comes as a surprise.
Yeah, it comes as a surprise. Not because it's from me, but because of the accent, I think, right?
Well, the funny thing is in Canada, everyone thinks he has a posh accent.
Oh, yeah.
This is going on in Canada, I don't want to be rude.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming in. We appreciate it.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot, James.
Thank you.